Okay, hey everybody. We're going to be doing this as a asynchronous lecture, and we've kind of moved some stuff around because the next bit that we're supposed to be talking about in class after our midterm is really stuff that actually works much better when you have a audience and the discussion points that we can have. So instead, I've jumped ahead a little bit and I've brought in where I'm kind of doing a little tutorial on how mark recapture analysis works. I understand that some of you have done a simple version of mark recapture in like an ecology class, but what I'm trying to introduce you to now is how you would actually go out and do mark recapture in the real world and all of the problems and hiccups that come with that. So we're just going to do a short little video on the intro and the background, and I'm going to bring up a project that you're going to be turning in a week's time after this class. Just a small little exercise to get your kind of feet wet in the world of mark recapture. So when we're doing mark recapture analysis, there are lots of tools. R is increasingly becoming a pretty common tool set that if you already have experience in R, it can be really useful. If you don't know what I'm talking about with program R, that will be something that you should probably look into pretty soon if you're going to go to graduate school or something like that. My background is I have mostly used program Mark instead of R. R is a kind of broad statistical package that does lots and lots of stuff. Program Mark is just for mark recapture stuff. So what are we actually talking about when we say something is a mark recapture study? What is it trying to find? Well, we're attempting to find how many animals are there. In the real world, I can't just look out into a forest and see, hey, there's 20 elephants. Maybe I can with something like an elephant. It becomes pretty easy. But most of the time when we're talking about these sort of systems, animals are hidden from us. Think either a big giant area that there's almost no way that I could check every place, or animals that are very solitary and will hide away from me, or very small animals, or something like an aquatic system where I can't just look out there and see exactly how many that are there. If I were assigned a problem that I'm saying, how many fish are in a lake? Well, how would I go about starting to do that? If I go through and just try and catch as many fish as I can, that is one way to do an estimate. Another way is to go about doing a mark recapture study. If we have quote unquote perfect knowledge, right? If the water is clear and we take a picture of that lake, we can count all of the individual fish. There's never been a time that that's actually ever happened, right? It's always more complicated than that. So we can do a really simple 2-round estimate using mark recapture. If I go out and catch some fish, I go out with my fishing rod or a net or traps or something along those lines, and I find 3 fish. Well, now I know there are at least 3 fish. There are probably more if I put more effort into catching fish that day, or if I use like dynamite to go and fish, I would probably find out that I had more fish. But I don't have enough money to pay somebody to fish all day long and pull every fish out of a lake. There could be talking about thousands of animals, right? So I go out and I catch a couple fish and I mark them. Either for fish, generally we like clip a little bit of their fins, or they can insert some like fluorescent dye in them or something like that. But I mark them in some way. For a lot of larger animals, we put like ear tags in for like bears, or microchipping them like you microchip a dog or a cat. So we've marked these animals. Now we wait, and those animals go back out in the lake, they mix, and what time we're talking about is going to be entirely species dependent. Are we talking about these animals mixing over an hour, or are we talking about these animals mixing over a couple of weeks, right? So it's going to be dependent on the animal and the biology of that species. And then we go out and try and catch some more. So when I go out and catch some more, I go out and catch another 4 fish. So, well, when I do, I find 2 fish, my individuals here and my individuals here, that I did not find in the first place. So I know that my first estimate of 3 fish had to be wrong, because here I've found 2 fish that I didn't see that initial time. Do I just assume there are 5 fish now, right? Because I know that there were 3, one additional one that I didn't catch this time around? No, that's obviously not the way to do this. The way to do this is just a little bit of math. And this math works like, okay, the number that you caught and marked in round 1 divided by the true population size. So this is what we're trying to hunt down. We're trying to hunt down N. This is the question that we're trying to get at. We want to find out what that true population size is. That's supposed to be an arrow. It doesn't look like an arrow. That's not important. So the number that I marked and captured in round 1 divided by the true population size, which is an unknown right now, we don't know what it is equal to the number of individuals that you catch in round 2 divided by the total caught individuals in round 2. What does that actually look like for this example, right? When we went through and caught fish in round 1, right, we caught 3 fish. And then when we went out in round 2, we ended up catching 4 fish, 2 of which were fish that we already knew. So now we do just a little math, right? 3 divided by N is equal to 1/2, right? If I do just a little bit of math here, I can figure out that the true population size is 6 individuals. What's the problem with this? It's not actually 6 individuals. We're wrong, right? Our two round estimate, our estimate of the population size is wrong in this case, right? We've underestimated the population size. It's incorrect. This sort of method is best used if you're catching a larger percent of the population, and in doing so, you have a better guess at how many individuals are actually really in that population. So if you're catching a very small fraction, like 2-3% of the overall population, well, that's not going to give you a good estimate. So if you go and catch 2% of the animals on round 1 and then another 2% on round 2, there's a very little likelihood that you actually have any individuals in both of those samples. So your math starts to get a little bit less helpful when we're talking about not capturing a good percentage. This method that we just did is something called Lincoln-Peterson or Lincoln Index. You'll get lots of different people. It's just the people that came up with the math behind it. So this Lincoln-Peterson index is useful, right? It's not a bad way to do it. If you have certain populations with different biologies that this works well with, and you're capturing a large percentage of the population, you can actually get a pretty good estimate out of this. Another way to do this is a method that I happen to subscribe to. That's something that I've done a fair amount of Jolly-Sieber models on. Is something called Jolly-Sieber. And Jolly-Sieber is just, again, the 2 people that found the math, that came up with the math to do it. And this is now no longer catching individuals like one capture event, waiting a little bit of time, and then having another capture event. In Jolly-Sieber models, you're actually going out and capturing multiple times. So you could go out and catch 100 times in a row, right? You're waiting a little bit of time between each of these captures. This is a better, more robust way to do most biological systems, because if you go out on one of those first 2 rounds and you just got unlucky, right? Maybe you didn't catch as many individuals as you would expect. Maybe that was a population decline that you saw. And then as the reproductive burst happens, the population will come back up. So there's lots of reasons why these 2 rounds are insufficient. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the problems with this as well. When we're doing 3 capture rounds, right, the math for that Lincoln-Peterson index was pretty easy, right? I could expect you to, on a test, given that formula, do this math without a calculator, right? That's my expectation if I'm giving you a problem that's kind of built to be done without a calculator. Jolly-Sieber, though, I would not be so cruel to try and give you a Jolly-Sieber model. Now that we start talking about multiple iterations, right? It's on my head. Now that we start talking about multiple iterations of captures, well, now I have to be starting to think about a lot more intense math. And generally, this is not something that we want to do on the back of a napkin. Generally, for these sorts of work, we're talking about trying to actually go out and get a computer to do this work for us. What does this actually look like? Well, these are all the formulas, and I don't expect you to know these formulas because we would never actually use them on paper. We would put them into, in this case, it's just an Excel file, and this is an example of a capture history where we went out and captured 15 individuals, or 20, there were 22 individuals that we could have captured, and we ended up seeing 15 of them, right? So then we ended up seeing that same 15 existing in that population again, and over time we start to capture more and more and more individuals. I don't expect the math to be something that is important for you to understand, but by doing this kind of iterative captures over and over again, multiple rounds of observations in our population, we start to get closer to what we might actually think the estimate is. And if you are looking at this, this is our estimate, right? So the population size estimate on the y-axis and how many samples we've performed, how many captures we've gone out there and looked at. This shows you how, as you accrue more data, you can actually start to wildly vary what you actually have your actual estimate is, right? We just so happened to catch in the 3 to 7 range. We ended up catching a lot of new individuals rather than re-seeing individuals that we've previously caught. So the fewer individuals that are known to us in each capture round, well, that's going to make us guess that, hey, our population is huge, and I'm only catching a small fraction of my previously marked individuals, so that tells me that my population estimate would be a lot higher. The more rounds that we go through, right, I would say that these would be a more reasonable estimate of population size because now we have a larger sample set of capture records that we can kind of compare over time. The problem with these 3+ capture rounds is the math gets a little bit more tricky, and we have to start thinking about a lot of assumptions in the way that we produce these models. What the parameters are, if I'm talking about going out and catching fish and then coming back the next day and catching fish, right, that initial 2 Lincoln-Peterson index, I'm not going to guess that there's been a huge birth boom or some event that has come through and killed a bunch of fish, right? I can assume that those 2 populations on those 2 days are pretty similar populations. But now that I start thinking about models that are maybe going on for years at a time, right? There's mark capture data that is literally 50 years old and they're continually adding more and more data to it, right? So now I have to think about, well, if I caught a moose in 1998, what's the actual chance that that moose is still alive right now, right? Is that moose dead from old age? What are the chances that it's gotten eaten by something, right? What are the chances that new moose have been added to that population? What's the chance that they've left, right? Including stuff like capture and recapture parameters, right? What is the probability of actually seeing an individual? This is to deal with things like trap happy or trap shy individuals. If you have an individual that is trap happy, I ran a program up at the Columbus Zoo where we trapped raccoons that were living on zoo grounds, so like a wild raccoon on zoo grounds. And I had most of my raccoons that I'd see every once in a while, right? I'd see them every other month or so. They'd stumble into one of my traps. That's about the normal background trapping rate. Then I had some individuals that were just completely fine getting trapped, right? When the first time they come into my traps, I would snip some of their reproductive organs off. And that's not a terribly fun thing. But after that first round, I was just kind of observing them. Sometimes I would take blood, sometimes I wouldn't take blood at all. So if you're a raccoon and you see this trap full of dog food, yeah, I'll just go in there, hang out there for the night, get a nice meal. In the morning, some guy will come by and let me out. That's not that big a deal. So I had a couple individuals, particularly one of them that lived right by the wolves, that got real trap happy. So he actually started to mess up some of my math because now I'm assuming that I'm not going to see him right? Or I'm going to assume that I'm going to see other raccoons at the same rate as him, and it can mess up a little bit of your math. Additionally, you can have individuals that become trap shy. I used to work in Yosemite National Park with bears, and we would have a bear that we knew was in an area, but it had a real rough time the last time we trapped it. We had these big, giant, big metal tubes that they would crawl into and pull on a bait bag, and the trap would fall behind them. And this bear hated that. So he decided never to go near one of those ever again. We knew he was in the area. We knew he was raiding people's food, but we couldn't end up trapping him because he was trap shy. So that affects how often these animals are walking into our observations as well. When we have these kinds of animals may die, animals may avoid capture, or animals may move into or out of an area, they would immigrate or emigrate. We assume some things to deal with this. These are assumptions, and these assumptions are wrong, right? Because no population, if you are talking about even a small window of time, no population is truly closed. There's always a chance that one of your marked individuals will die, right? No loss of marking, right? So if I'm tagging my raccoons, there was a risk that if they ripped that ear tag out, or it got caught on a fence or something and ripped out of their ear, well, there's a risk that I would see that raccoon again in a trap, and I would think it's a new raccoon. Now, I actually ear tagged and microchipped my raccoons between their shoulder blades, so that's much less likely that you're going to lose that marking. But that can be a problem. So you assume that there's going to be a really low risk of losing that mark, or no risk at all. These assumptions are wrong, right? They are assumptions that are not realistic to the real world. A closed population, right? I have 4 frogs the first time I survey, and I have those 4 same frogs are there, right? Nobody gets in, nobody gets out. That's obviously wrong, right? That's not real. But we consider this a closed population so that when we're taking a picture of how the population at time 1 and we take another picture of the population at time 2, we can easily compare them and assume that no changes to that population have happened. Open populations are almost invariably the actual event, right? Where we have a new individual born, we have some immigration and emigration, right? Open populations are the norm. We can perform a little bit more complicated math to try and adjust for these open populations, but it's not as easy as some of the more simple closed populations. If you can assume that your population is closed, it makes your job a little bit easier. All of these assumptions are unrealistic, right? They're not real, right? We are just assuming these things to make the math easier on ourselves. So if you are trapping, right, the probabilities of trapping an animal on 2 days are literally never going to be exactly equal. Trap happiness, trap shyness, right? Maybe an animal had a big meal right before it found the trap the second time and says, I'm already stuffed. I couldn't eat another bite of your dog food, your cat food. Peanut butter works really well for dogs. Or you could have just personal preferences on how you set that trap up, right? Maybe one person goes and sets it up underneath of a bush, another person sets it out in the middle of out exposed to nowhere. There's going to be different experiences that the trapper has that then that animal may prefer to go into one trap or another, right? So these probabilities are never the equal. We try and adjust for all of this and kind of hope that the math helps us out in the end, right? We hope that these assumptions that we're making try and even them out. When we're doing this in Program Mark, we're going to do a little bit of programming in this class. I know this is conservation biology, but there's actually a lot of computers in conservation biology. When we're talking about Program Mark, we record them in whether an animal was trapped or not, right? We record that as either ones or zeros in a long chain. So in this individual capture histories that we're seeing, we went out and we captured animals. We waited a little bit. We captured animals. And we waited a little bit and captured it again. So there were three possibilities of observing an animal. If an animal was seen in the first one, and then we never see it again, it would have a 1, 0, 0, right? Maybe we trapped it that first time, we let it go, and then it immediately ran out and got hit by a car. There's no possibility that we would have ever seen that animal again, right? Alternatively, if we have an animal that has a capture history that we didn't see it the first two times that we went out, and then we saw it that third time, maybe it was there and we could have caught it those first two times, and we just happened not to, right? Random chance. Or maybe this is an animal that just got born. Maybe this is an animal that just immigrated to the area, and then we trapped it on that third time, right? So this capture histories are not as the more capture histories we can get, the more helpful it can be. Especially capture histories like this second one, where we caught an individual, we didn't catch that individual, and then we caught that individual again. So this is one of the ways that we can guess what is the likelihood of actually catching an individual, is knowing that this individual existed, right? He or she had to be alive right there. We just didn't see him, right? So that's one way that we can start adjusting our capture probabilities over time. Program Mark is a program that is just designed, it only does one thing, and it makes mark recapture models. Whether we're talking about a mark recapture model like Jolly Seaver or the Lincoln Index that we just talked about, lots of other versions of this, right? Maybe you want to make adjustments to say, all right, I expect this set of data for males and this set of data for females. Maybe the males have higher fatality rates, often do, because the males are dumb and fight each other. Well, in that case, now I have to have one set of data for my survival and recapture estimates for a female in that population, but I have to have a different set of expectations for the male in that system, right? So lots of different ways that we can do this. We could be looking at going out and trapping individuals. We could be doing studies that are doing mark recite, right? So examples where you like take a photo of a rhino, and then the next time you see that rhino, maybe that particular shape of their horns can be something that is uniquely identifying to the animal. Think like the coat pattern on a tiger or the spots that you see on leopard seals, right? I can individually identify that, so it's almost as if I'm marking that. It's a picture that I have and can compare to other pictures later on, and I can do this sort of work to fit all of these possible different model design strategies, right, for your particular biological system. Maybe it's something that you really can't get your hands on them. Maybe it's something like you're observing them once a year when they come back to a nest, right? So there's lots of different ways that you would set this up. When you're building models, and a model in this case is just a way that we're trying to estimate population size. We can make something like a survival estimates. In this case, we're going out there and capturing 7 times. And P in this case is the probability of survival. So you are making decisions that there's not like a recipe. There's no one right way to do this. You're making choices based on what's going on in your study and making choices based on what biologically makes sense for your species. Now, if we're making 7 captures, right? So we captured 7 different times. Well, what is the probability that they survive from time 1 to time 2, right? Is it something more like this one here on the left, and I'm just going to call this A, or is it something more like the probability on B? If the probability of surviving from time 1 to time 2 is the same as the probability of surviving from 4 to 5, right? There's consistent survival probability. maybe you make these captures the same day on the same year, or every other year, right? So there's a year between all of these, and the chance that you think that an individual is going to survive from year to year is the same. Well, then A makes more sense for you. If you're doing something that maybe there's you're making captures every couple months, maybe you make 3 a year or something like that. And then one of those sections, maybe there's a drought going on during these captures, right? Maybe there's some high fatality event that's occurring, like migrations, or we're real rough on things, right? Well, then I wouldn't want to assume that the survival probability between time 3 and 4, right, the chance that they make it to those time periods is probably different when we're not in a drought. So I would make a different assumption when I'm structuring the model, right? Whether we're talking about things being completely variable, whether we're just trying to describe something as maybe if I know it's a bad year, maybe I might intentionally give that one individual year a different survival rate, but I'll make all the other ones the same, right? This is where there's some skill and a little bit of art to the design of these sorts of models. When you create a model, it's going to spit out a number. And Program Mark is actually pretty notorious for spitting out a number, whether or not that number is right or not. And if I make a couple different ideas on how these models are set up, either I vary survival or I don't vary survival. Maybe I vary capture probability by males versus females, or I vary survival based on age of the individual. Well, that means that when I'm running these sorts of models, I have a bunch of different outputs. And when I have a bunch of different outputs, I need to be able to choose to be which one is the most correct model. And we use something called AICC weighting. We can also use AIB weighting, not important for us. But all this means is the most closely that it matches what's going on in the real world with the fewest number of parameters. That's what we're trying to do, right? We don't want to have males and females be different and 1 to 2 year olds be different from 3 to 4, which is different than 5 to 6, right? If there isn't actually a difference between age classes, and if there isn't actually a difference between sexes, adding in more parameters hurts that model, right? Because it's kind of overfitting the model to what is going on in the real world. So when we have a bunch of different model options, it spits out an AIC at the end. And that the model that has the best explanation for what you see with those capture histories with as few parameters is the one that we select as the most likely model, right? I just said this, right? Be careful. Mark does not generally give error messages. If you do things that are impossible, Mark will just say, okay, that's fine, and then give you an output. So you have to look at the outputs and let you know whether or not it's actually a real thing. I have seen like animals coming back to life after they were considered dead, right? If you put the data in wrong, if you like record them as dying and you find their corpse, and then later on accidentally record it as seeing that individual, Mark will be like, okay, cool, that's fine. Zombie deer exist, great. And it will use that data to input and change your population size estimates. So it actually does. You have to be pretty careful in the way that you handle inputting data into Mark. Now I would like you to go and I'd like you to play around with Program Mark. I'm not expecting you to become a master at Mark. I just want to start dipping your toes in this a little bit. What I'd like you to do is if you just search for Program Mark on Google, this is what's going to pop up for you. Is this visible? Yeah. So Program Mark is going to pop up. It's put out by Colorado State University, and its website is Phi-Dot. Phi-Dot is a parameter in Program Mark. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to download Mark and I'd like you to install it. It's all free. It's not going to have spyware or anything in it. It's a legitimate thing from a legitimate university. And the reason why I'm having you do this with Mark is this is something that you will very likely use if you are going out to work in the field on analysis. So having a little bit of experience and knowing what this stuff is and being able to kind of blunder your way around is actually really useful. There's an entire free book, right? So you download Mark, right? Whichever version you're using. And if you are, after you've downloaded Mark, there's some documentation and there's a book that I want you to go to. Program Mark, A Gentle Introduction is really just that. It's actually a really nice, well-made book for someone that doesn't have a lot of background in Mark Recapture. I say that because I taught myself Mark through this book, a decade ago. All of this book is freely available. You don't have to pay for anything or anything like that. It has a couple chapters you can read. You're more than welcome to read the introduction and data formatting. I've kind of glossed over some of that stuff in this lecture. The one I want you to focus on is I want you to take the first steps chapter. And what the first steps chapter is just a couple pages. And this is basically a guide in how to do a tutorial on a population. And it has data if you have, once you've downloaded Program Mark, it actually already tells you how to get a sample data set, and you're going to be doing this with dippers, right? So you're going to be finding this dipper data set and then actually performing a Mark analysis on it. At the end of it, it's going to spit out something called a DBF file. That's your database file of results. And what I'd like you to do, you're going to have something that looks an awful lot like this, where you are producing estimates for populations. I'd like you to submit a DBF to Blackboard. After working on this tutorial, it should be something that takes you about an hour is what I'm hoping. If you are completely out of your depth in this, I'm more than happy to help you and work through this with you. Reminder, I have my office hours on Tuesday night at 9:30 till 10:30, and Fridays in the mornings from around 10:15, right after our class, all the way until 11:15, and I can be a little bit later than that if I need to, if that can help you out. So I'd like you to do the tutorial that's laid out in this, and it's going to spit out a DBF file, and I'd like you to submit that DBF file to Blackboard. I'm going to open up an assignment here in a second, right? You're going to have a DBF file that spits out. So that is what I'd like from you. I am going to post this and let you start working on this now. All right. If you have any questions, reminder, send me an email, or you can drop in on my office hours and I can help you work through this.